This lecture is being brought to you in part by the generous gifts of these sponsors.
Thank you very much, Christine, and I want to thank Dr. Ken Ford and the Florida Institute on Cognitive and Machine Learning, Human and Machine Cognition. It's a pleasure to be here in Florida with you, and I hope to convince you that techniques for using the brain as a whole can sometimes be far superior to techniques approaching the brain in pieces with medication or other kinds of treatments. I do both, but there's a lot we can learn from how we use our brains in controlling problems like pain, stress, and anxiety. The way I try to teach this to the students at Stanford is to remind them that the strain in pain lies mainly in the brain. Now, I think, I won't sing it, I just thought I'd say it. So I hope this will strike you as a radically different way for us to think about practicing medicine. And a colleague of mine in Texas reminded me of a doctor who gave a talk like this, and a very wealthy man in the audience said, you know, if every medical student and doctor in the United States heard your talk, medicine would be better. So what's your salary? And he told him, and he said, well, I will triple it if you'll spend the next year driving around the country giving this talk. So he thought about it for a minute and said, okay. After a couple of months, he and the chauffeur who was driving him got to be uncomfortably close. And the chauffeur said, you know, Doc, I've heard that damn talk of yours so many times that I could give it, and you're getting paid 50 times what I'm getting paid. And the doctor said, well, okay, I'll tell you what. The next talk is not very important. It's just at Harvard. So why don't I put on the chauffeur uniform and you give the talk and we'll see what happens. So he gives the talk, and it actually goes surprisingly well. And then a hand goes up, and a full professor in the audience asks a very long and exceedingly complex question. And the chauffeur says, you know, I've heard some ignorant questions in my day. Said, but this one is so ignorant that I'm going to let my chauffeur answer it. So, I haven't brought my chauffeur, but we'll have time for questions. So what I hope to do is describe for you the phenomenon of hypnosis, both in mind and in body, help you understand the concept of hypnotizability as a trait. Not everyone's hypnotizable. About 2/3 of adults are. Most children are. So, you know, most 8-year-olds are in trances most of the time. You know, you call them in for dinner, they don't hear you. But some of us lose that ability as adults. Talk about our research on brain regions involved in hypnosis, how hypnosis can modulate perception of problems like pain and anxiety, how hypnosis can directly influence things going on in the body that you wouldn't think you could control, and then how we use it at Stanford as a program of support for patients with a variety of medical and psychiatric problems. You may all have heard the term mesmerized. You know, you mesmerized me with your gaze. Franz Anton Mesmer was the doctor who formally introduced hypnosis into Western culture. And it is the oldest Western conception of a psychotherapy, the first time that a talking interaction was thought to have therapeutic potential. He had this theory that hypnosis, he called it animal magnetism, the idea that there were magnetic fields flowing through our bodies and that when the fields got out of line, patients got sick. And he thought if he put his magnetic fields near the patient's magnetic fields, the patients would get better. I don't know why his wouldn't get worse, but after a while, he started using these paquets, these barrels with, this thing doesn't seem to be working, filled with iron filings that could induce things like swooning in this woman you see on the right. Now, that sounds kind of hokey, and it is, but keep in mind that the leading sciences of the day were physics, the study of gravity and electricity and magnetism. And so the idea of finding an analogy between what were the leading new scientific understandings and what was going on in the brain was not as bad an idea as it might seem. Although I think I should warn you that there are side effects to hypnosis, so be careful. Mesmer left his wife and family in Vienna as soon as he started to become the sort of go-to doctor at the time and moved to Paris. And there he competed with the leading French physicians of the day, which did not win him a lot of friends in the rest of the medical community. Now, if you did a randomized trial, sending every other medically ill patient to Mesmer doing this animal magnetism or French physicians, how many of you think Mesmer's patients would have done better medically? Anyone? How many think the French physicians' patients would have done better? Nobody. Well, you're both right in a sense. Think about it. What was the major form of treatment in 18th century France? Bleeding, bloodletting. France was the world's leading exporter of leeches. Voltaire wrote to his brother, he said, "We did everything we could to save father's life. We even sent the doctors away." And so if you just stayed away from a doctor by going to Mesmer, you would actually do better. So he was examined by a French panel of experts. King Louis convened a panel that included our own Benjamin Franklin, who was having a wonderful time in Paris in those days, the famous and brilliant chemist Lavoisier, who discovered the principles of oxygen chemistry and who also, shortly before he died, developed the concept of the gross national product. So he actually was a leading economist as well as chemist. He was beheaded in the Revolution. And not unrelated was another member of the panel, well known for his work in pain control. He was Dr. Guillotin, the inventor of the guillotine. So it was quite a group. He kind of created the mind-body problem, in a sense. And so this group investigated Mesmer and concluded that animal magnetism was due to nothing but heated imagination. Now, that's probably right, actually, but it was a devastating opinion, and that was pretty much the end of Mesmer's career. However, there were brave followers who carried on, including a man named James Esdale, who was a Scottish surgeon who went to India and was doing the terrible surgery they did. It was mostly amputations. They had no anesthesia at all, so they would typically get a patient drunk and hold them down while they performed the surgery. He started using animal magnetism, mesmerism, in India, and was reporting 80% surgical anesthesia, which is not bad in a terrible setting. So he was fired from his hospital in Scotland, and 10 years later, at the Massachusetts General Hospital, what is now called the Ether Dome, the first use of ether anesthesia was reported, and the surgeon strode to the front of the auditorium and said, "Gentlemen, this is no humbug," to distinguish what they did with ether from what Esdale had done with hypnosis, with mesmerism. And they reported 90% surgical anesthesia with ether, so Esdale actually withdrew his paper, said, "Sorry, I guess I was wrong." So it's taken us 150 years to figure out that the brain actually does have something to do with pain control, and that there are things one can do with the brain as a whole, with not just putting it to sleep, but using it, that can help people deal better with problems like pain. Sigmund Freud started his career, and hypnosis I sometimes think of as something like the oldest profession. Everybody's interested in it, but nobody wants to be seen in public with it. Here I am. It's one rejection after another. Freud started his studies of psychoanalysis using hypnosis. And the famous analytic couch, this is his study in Vienna, was there because he was using it to hypnotize people. And you'll notice that in the sacred spot over the couch, there's a picture of an archaeological dig, and Freud was very interested in deeper and deeper levels of understanding in the unconscious and how to reach them. When an event occurred early in his career, he was hypnotizing a woman, relieving her of her attacks of pain by tracing them back to a traumatic origin. And he wrote in his autobiography, "The patient suddenly woke out of the trance and threw her arms around my neck. He said, I was modest enough not to attribute this event to my own irresistible personal attractiveness." And so that was the beginning of the concept of transference, the idea that patients transfer feelings about figures early in their life, usually parents, onto other people in their lives. And you use that phenomenon in analysis to better understand the distortions people make about their relationships. So Freud gave up hypnosis and moved the chair around behind the couch because he didn't like patients staring him in the eye, and he had them free associate. Now, this is, and to this day, most psychoanalysts say it's a terrible idea to use hypnosis. I visited his last study, which is in London. He was chased by the Nazis out of Austria, and set up this study here, and he saw to the arrangement of the study. And in the sacred spot over the analytic couch, there's now a new picture, and it is of the famous French neurologist Charcot demonstrating hypnotic catalepsy. So he has a patient who's hypnotized and falls backward if he didn't hold her. And Freud wrote at the end of his career that the baser metal of suggestion probably would have to be alloyed. I mean, that the pure gold of analysis would have to be alloyed with the baser metal of suggestion. So Freud, at the end of his career, came back to the idea that maybe direct suggestion to people could actually have an effect on them and their symptoms. The final example is the experience of this woman. She was a woman who suffered from spinal weakness, which meant she had to be carried around from room to room by her father. This happened through her adolescence, through her marriage, and even her pregnancy, and that was finally too much for her. And so she went to see a disciple of Mesmer's named Phineas T. Quinby. Great name, isn't it? And he cured her with using animal magnetism. And she was very happy and pleased. And as time went on, they corresponded. Some people speculate they had some kind of sexual involvement. But about 5 years later, she got a letter informing her that he had died suddenly. And the next day, she went into a period of meditation and mourning. She slipped on the ice and re-injured her back. And she decided after that that it was not really animal magnetism that had cured her, it was the Word of God. Does anybody know who this woman is? Mary Baker Eddy, that's right. So we owe to hypnosis the introduction of psychoanalysis into our culture and to one of the better remaining newspapers in the United States, the Christian Science Monitor. I was touring with some friends from a hypnosis meeting actually in Boston, the Mother Church of Christian Science, which is a beautiful, amazing building, big circular building where any person can stand and give testimony about how they had cured themselves with the help of God. And this nice lady was taking us around until I happened to mention the meeting we were at, the hypnosis meeting, and she got cold as ice and couldn't get us out of there fast enough. And then I read the lesson plan for next week. Ancient and modern necromancy, alias mesmerism and hypnotism denounced. Necromancy, loving the dead. So to this day, you can't mention hypnosis around a Christian Scientist. So anything that starts so many interesting things and gets so roundly rejected, to me, had to be worth looking into. This is my daughter's depiction of what I do. She said, my dad hypnotizes people and makes them want to live longer. And you see a particularly successful clinical example down here. Now, Julia is now an attorney, and she says, Dad, are you still using that picture? And I say, yes, I am. But it does not represent her current level of artistic ability. So what is hypnosis and how can we use it? It is a treatment approach that is useful in a variety of medical and psychiatric and psychological settings. And it can be understood as having three main components. The first is absorption. Being hypnotized is something like looking through a telephoto lens in a camera. What you see with great detail, but you're less aware of the context. How many of you have had the experience of getting so caught up in a good movie that you forget you're watching a movie and just kind of enter the imagined world? Anybody? How many of you have no idea what I was just talking about? The former are likely to be more hypnotizable than the latter. It's been called believed-in imagination. You don't judge it, you just experience it. And time may fly by, you don't realize how fast it's going. People who are more hypnotizable tend to get caught up in sunsets and movies and reading novels and forget time just goes by and they don't notice it. So it's a kind of non-judgmental awareness. So this means that you have to put outside of conscious awareness things that would ordinarily be in consciousness. We call that dissociation. Right now, you're having sensations with your bottoms touching these wonderful chairs that have been provided for you. Hopefully that was not foremost in your mind until I brought it to your attention. If it was, you can leave now. That's all right. So in order for us to concentrate intently, we have to put outside of awareness things we might otherwise pay attention to. The third, and for some people the most worrisome part, is what's been called suggestibility. It's a tendency to respond relatively automatically to instructions or suggestions. People see this caricatured in stage hypnotists, whom I don't like. You know, having a football coach dance like a ballerina or people quack like a duck. There are two things you should know about these guys other than that they're exploiting people, and please don't pay money to go see them. But one of them is that they don't do this to everybody. What they do, if you've been to any of these shows, they filter people through. They get people up, they have them sit down until they find the 10 or 15% of the population who are very hypnotizable. And they're the ones that they work with. And they use it to make fools of them, which I don't like, I don't agree with. But the message is that in hypnosis, people are less likely to critically judge and evaluate what you're asking them to do. And that puts more responsibility on you as a doctor using hypnosis to be wise and careful about how you're advising people to do things. But it's a two-edged sword. It can bypass people's usual unwillingness to do things that are good for themselves and change for the better, or it can bypass their scrutiny about things that make them seem foolish or worse. So it is possible that people will do things in hypnosis they might not otherwise do, but if you go to a licensed and trained professional, that's not the problem. So keep in mind, though, that your ability to focus attention means that you're less likely to critically judge and evaluate what's going on. Now, people do this spontaneously all the time. All hypnosis is really self-hypnosis. I just evaluate and help people to do what they have the ability to do. And there, for example, in the Sochi Olympics, when Putin decided, among his many good decisions, to put the Winter Olympics in a place that barely had any snow, a number of the athletes wanted, of course, to do practice runs down the ski runs, and they could only do one run because the snow was in such bad shape. So they would stand by them and go into a self-hypnotic-like state and practice the run mentally because they couldn't do it physically. So here's an example of Bode Miller doing it. They would visualize the course twice, sometimes eyes closed, sometimes eyes open, but I'm always kind of zoned out, one of the skiers said. So they do it in a kind of self-hypnotic way that allows them to concentrate intently and not worry too much about the fact that they weren't actually skiing. Hypnotizability is a very stable trait in adult life. There was a study done at Stanford where former students were tested for hypnotizability 25 years after they had been undergraduates and had their hypnotizability tested. And there was a 0.7 test-retest correlation. Now, for those who don't do statistics, what that means is that I could tell you about half the variance in your hypnotizability score when you were 25 if I knew what it was when you were 50. And that is more stability than you'll see in an IQ test over a 25-year interval. So it's a very stable trait. Some people have the ability, some don't. This is a kind of distribution of scores, and about, as I said, 2/3 of the adult population is at least somewhat hypnotizable. We've been very interested in what's going on in the brain that can help us explain that. So several years ago, we did a study in which we took 10 people who tested very highly hypnotizable and 10 on the other end of the distribution, not at all hypnotizable, and put them in a functional MRI scanner. Magnetic resonance imaging, I'm sure you're all familiar with that term, is widely used. It gives you beautiful pictures of brain anatomy, but it can also be used to measure brain function because deoxygenation of blood, which happens when blood is flowing through more active regions in the brain, looks different on an fMRI image. So we can measure brain function as well as structure. And we looked at 3 brain networks and how they related to one another when high versus low hypnotizables were in the scanner and simply resting. They weren't doing anything. We weren't trying to hypnotize them. They were just resting. And what we saw was a connection between one part of the brain, the anterior cingulate cortex, which is in the middle front part of the brain, and it's a context detector. It helps us decide what to pay attention to and what to ignore. If an air traffic controller sees 3 planes converging on one runway, their anterior cingulate cortex is going wild because they know there's a problem they have to deal with. And so it's a kind of a part of our worry system. We call it the salience network. And we found that activity in that region was significantly correlated with activity in the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. That's up here. And it's what we call part of our executive control network. So you guys may be sleeping, but my executive control network is really working here because I'm trying to convey this information to you. We found that in highly hypnotizable subjects, those 2 regions were working together. When one was up, the other was up. And so that's a situation in which if you tend to concentrate intently, you tend not to be worrying about what else is going on because those two activities are coordinated. So there is a biological signature of people who are highly hypnotizable that distinguishes them from people who are not hypnotizable. And it's a substantial and statistically significant difference. We have evidence that hypnotizability is correlated with the activity of the neurotransmitter dopamine in the brain. It's one of the major neurotransmitters in the brain, particularly in the basal ganglia, motor regions of the brain, and in the frontal cortex. It's the neurotransmitter that is depleted when people develop Parkinson's disease, for example, but it's very much involved in active thought and cognition. And we found a significant correlation between levels of a metabolite of dopamine, homovanillic acid, and hypnotizability in a large patient sample. So it makes sense. The thing we saw in the previous study makes sense in terms of dopamine. There's actually a genetic connection. So people who have a particular variant of the COMT gene, that's catechol-O-methyltransferase, that's a gene that's involved in dopamine metabolism, turn out to be more highly hypnotizable than those who have a different variant or polymorphism of that gene. So there's a genetic link too. And you see here, these are the ones who have valine and methionine version versus the ones who are homozygous for valine or methionine. So there is a genetic connection of these traits. We use a scale called the Hypnotic Induction Profile to measure how hypnotizable people are. It's the first time I formally use hypnosis with a patient. And I'm not trying to do something to them. I'm trying to assess how well they can respond to a standard hypnotic induction. And I use that as the basis of designing the rest of my treatment planning. This is another way of looking at the anterior cingulate cortex here, and there's evidence that when people control pain using hypnosis, they turn down activity in this region because the ACC is also part of the pain network that helps your brain decide, yes, this really is a painful and unpleasant stimulus, and there are other related psychological tests that are influenced by activity in this region as well. And the prefrontal cortex is another region that we know from other studies is involved in hypnosis. Most recently, we just published a study in which we looked at what happened when we actually hypnotized people in the fMRI scanner. How many of you had an fMRI? Have you had it? Brain or a magnetic resonance imaging study. It's a noisy thing. You slid into this bore, and the machine is clacking away as it's generating the magnetic pulses that provide just enough deformation that when your brain goes back to its normal state, the sensors can read and interpret it. We found 36 high and 21 low hypnotizable subjects after screening 545 students. We worked hard to get this group. And when we put them in the scanner, we had 4 conditions. One was just rest, as we'd done before. One was a memory task to control for the effects of memory. And 2 of them were hypnosis conditions, where we hypnotized them, and one of them said, you're on a nice vacation. Remember what the vacation was like. Another, think about something that makes you really happy. Just have some positive feelings. And so we looked at what was different between the high and low hypnotizables in and out of hypnosis. And we found 3 major findings. The first was a reduced activity in that same region I mentioned before, the anterior cingulate cortex. So you see the activity went down in that area. And the more it went down, the more hypnotized the subjects thought they were. The second is higher connectivity, functional connectivity, between the executive control region, the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, and a little grape-sized part of the brain called the insula. The insula is a part of the brain that regulates activity in the body. It regulates blood pressure, involved in heart rate, and as well as part of the pain pathway. So it helps us interpret pain. So it's a state in which people are more closely connected to the part of their brain that regulates how their body is working and feeling. The third is inverse connectivity between the executive control region and a deep structure in the brain that we call the default mode network. If you're just sitting and reflecting on yourself, not particularly doing anything as a task, your default mode network is active. So when you're doing a hypnotic task, you're turning off your self-reflection. You're disconnecting, you're dissociating. And that's why people may do things in hypnosis that they ordinarily wouldn't do, because they're not so worried about what it means to themselves or to other people if they're doing it. So we now have a pretty clear brain signature of what happens when people are in a hypnotic state. And the next thing we're going to do is we're starting now to use transcranial magnetic stimulation, so this is real magnetism, to influence activity in brain regions that can affect hypnosis, to see if we can further enhance the hypnotic state. So we're in a sense trying to amplify hypnotic techniques using real magnetism. So in hypnosis, you're in a mental state where you can, rather than just reacting to events that come in from the world, you can actually manipulate them. You can manipulate perception. Normally, we use the front part of our brains to control the world. It's our motor cortex, the place where we plan, the place where we use speech, the way I'm using speech now with you. And the back part of the brain is our receptor brain, where we are responding to sounds and visual input and somatosensory input. And typically, we react with the back and we act with the front. But we can use hypnosis to actually control our ability to perceive the environment and to perceive it in a different way. And I'll show you some examples of that. This is one clinical example here. We did this study some years ago with a colleague of mine from Harvard who was sort of skeptical about hypnosis. And he said, you know, maybe if you just turn off perception, you can just shut your brain down, and it doesn't mean anything very specific. He was interested in visual imagery. So we identified using a different technique, positron emission tomography, blood flow in regions of the brain that were associated with looking at color here. And we had people look at color and black and white grids. They were highly hypnotizable. And we asked them in hypnosis to change their perception of the grid, sort of like what you're doing here. So drain color from the color grid, and in another condition, add color to the black and white grid. And they could do that. They would see the black and white grid as colorful and the color grid as black and white. And what we found was that when they were adding color to a black and white grid, they increased blood flow in those regions. And when they were draining color from a color grid, they decreased blood flow in those regions. So I call that my believing is seeing experiment. That in hypnosis, you could change perception to the extent that it seemed real, but your brain was acting as though it were real. So you're not just getting the same perception and acting differently, you're actually changing your perception. So there continues to be interest in hypnosis in places like Newsweek, back when we used to have news magazines. This is another study in which we used a different technique called event-related potentials. We measured electrical activity on the scalp. We gave a series of shocks to the wrists of 10 highly hypnotizable people. The red line is their brain's normal response to those shocks. And in the yellow line condition, we gave them the same shocks, but I hypnotized them and said, your hand's in circulating ice water, it's cold, tingling, and numb. It'll filter the hurt out of the pain. And here you see that the brain's electrical response to those same signals was half as big out here. At a tenth of a second after the signals, there was no reaction at all. So we were really changing the way their brains processed these pain signals. And that indicates the potential for some really powerful clinical effects. This is work from a group in University of Montreal, Pierre Rainville and colleagues, where they showed that the words you use change the part of the brain that gives you analgesia. So if you say what I said in the previous experiment, your hand is cool, tingling, and numb, you'll filter the hurt out of the pain. You got pain relief, but the pain relief was in somatosensory cortex back here, where we process somatic sensations. If you told them instead, the pain's there, but it won't bother you very much, which is what people sometimes report when they take opiates, here the change was in the anterior cingulate cortex. The somatosensory cortex was the same, here was the anterior cingulate. So we're able to turn on or off different parts of the brain depending just on what we tell people in hypnosis. So this is a technique that allows us to not just shut down the brain in general, but to use very specific brain regions to obtain very specific results. Now, if you'd like, we can try a little self-hypnosis exercise here. If any of you don't want to do it, don't do it, just sit here. But I thought I would try to give you an experience that gives you a sense for what hypnosis is really like. So if you'd like, get as comfortable as you can. All right, and then on one, do one thing, look up high as you can. On two things, slowly close your eyes and take a deep breath. And on three, let the breath out, let your eyes relax, but keep them closed, and let your body float. Imagine you're floating somewhere safe and comfortable, like a bath, a lake, a hot tub, or just floating in space. Each breath deeper and easier. With each breath out, let a little more of the tension out of your body. If you have some discomfort in some part of your body, imagine that region is warmer or cooler or tingling or numb. If you get relief from pain taking a warm bath, imagine you're floating in a warm bath or a hot tub. If you get relief from coolness instead, imagine you have a bag of ice over that part of your body, or that you're floating in a cool mountain lake. Warm or cool tingling numbness, let it filter the hurt out of the pain. Each breath deeper and easier. Picture in your mind's eye an imaginary screen. It might be a movie screen or a TV screen or a piece of clear blue sky, and picture on it a pleasant scene, somewhere you enjoy being. And notice how quickly and easily you can use your store of memories and fantasies to help yourself and your body feel better. Now, please take a few moments to reflect on what this feels like to you in a private sense, and then when you're ready, bring yourself out of the state of self-hypnosis by counting backwards from 3 to 1. On 3, you'll get ready. 2, with your eyelids closed, roll up your eyes, and 1, open. Ready? 3, 2, 1. Everybody okay? We didn't lose anyone here? I didn't see anybody actually floating, but anybody have an experience they want to share with us? Well, think about it for later, maybe during the question period if you had some. But this gives you an idea of what hypnosis is like, that it's a simple, safe, and effective technique. How many of you felt some change in your body when you did this? How many of you felt better? Did you feel? So you see, you can very quickly use this state of self-hypnosis to help yourself and your body feel better. And this is a kind of thing over a longer period of time and with more instruction that I tend to use to help patients in dealing with problems like pain and stress. People are, we got a raucous crowd over here. Is there anything you want to share with us, or just? He said he fell in love with her. And I told him it's not because of you. Who did you mean by you, me or him? I take no further responsibility for what happens here. So as I mentioned, the cingulate cortex is a major region of importance here. In turning that down, you're able to allow yourself to put aside other concerns and allow your body to feel differently. Now, pain is an important example. We know that there is a pain pathway. When you stub your toe, you'll notice that first you notice you've stubbed it, and after a few seconds it starts to hurt because the nerves that carry the pain signals through the lateral spinothalamic tract up into the brain are not well myelinated, so they conduct impulses very slow, and it's a long way to go. So then it starts to hurt. And that's how your brain identifies that something's happened to your body and there's pain. However, we also know that there is top-down regulation of pain as well. So you can change the way you experience pain from your brain down as well as from your body on up, as you can see here. I think you can see that the baby is the one who's getting the shot and the father is the one who's in pain. So the brain's interpretation of the signal has a lot to do with how much it hurts. As an example, we did a randomized trial in which we took 241 patients who had to have arterial cut-downs. We don't use general anesthesia for this, but you're on the table for 2 to 3 hours. You have catheters threaded through your arteries to embolize tumors in the liver or visualize constrictions in arteries around the kidneys or elsewhere. You're anxious about what's happening. There is pain involved. And we randomized them to 3 conditions. Standard care, everybody could push a button and have opiates injected into their vein. One was structured attention, so you had a nice nurse in addition to the IV opiates. You had a nice nurse comforting you. And the third was someone trained to teach you self-hypnosis. And we randomized patients to those 3 conditions, so they didn't choose it, we chose them. And here's what happened in terms of their pain reaction. So in the first hour, they weren't so different. But by the end of 2.5 hours, the pain ratings of the hypnosis group were 1 out of 10, and the pain ratings of the standard care group were 4 out of 10. So they had 4 times as much pain. We looked at their anxiety ratings, and I was afraid the hypnosis group had all died because they had no anxiety at all. And it was 4.5 out of 10 in the standard care group, and in between for the nursing support group. The ones who had the standard care had used twice as much pain medication as the patients in the other group. The average procedure time was 17 minutes shorter for the ones who got the hypnosis. And we noted, by the way, that the staff was less anxious because they could see that they were not making their patients as uncomfortable. And there were fewer adverse interoperative events in the hypnosis group, 8, compared to the standard care group, 34. We actually found that we would save $328 a procedure using the hypnosis, even though we had to pay an extra person to be in the room because they were so much more comfortable and used so much less medication. And this raises a serious question. You know, I know the opiate epidemic is a terrible problem here. I understand that today the governor of Florida allocated an extra $26 million to do something about the prescription opiate problems here. People are also moving in, people who would never be, you know, street drug abusers are buying opiates like fentanyl and heroin because they're cheaper than the prescription opiates that they are getting, or they can't get more of them. 1 out of 4 Americans with private health insurance has at least 1 opiate prescription a month. So we have a terrible addiction problem. And when I was in medical school, we were taught that if you have real pain, you don't get addicted to opiates. Well, it turns out that's just wrong. That opiates are good for acute pain control for a few days, but hypnosis can be too. But if you're on an opiate for more than 3 days, the odds of you getting addicted start going up. And what happens is you get rebound pain. It's what keeps people addicted. The pain gets worse. You're occupying the opiate receptors. We have endogenous opiate receptors. We have our own. We make our own endogenous opiates to help us manage pain. But you sensitize those receptors when you withdraw the opiates. And so these people get hooked and stuck. So there's a tremendous need for us to develop non-pharmacologic ways of helping people deal with pain. One of them is acupuncture. The mastodon is responding very well to this approach. It works for chronic pain as well. This is from a randomized trial we did sponsored by the National Cancer Institute and National Institute of Mental Health, in which we taught women with advanced metastatic breast cancer who met once a week for support groups to do self-hypnosis like we did together at the end of the group. And by the end of a year, our treatment patients had half the pain of the control patients on the same and very low amounts of medication. And we were able to repeat that finding in another study we did a mere 15 years later. So it works for acute as well as chronic pain. And it really is a shame that we're not making more use of people's own ability to regulate their brains in regulating their pain experience. Hypnosis is being used now for breast biopsies to make a diagnosis of breast cancer, and even for lumpectomies, to actually remove a tumorous lump from a breast. So it is possible to use it safely and effectively in even fairly major surgical procedures as well as diagnostic procedures. He's saying the way we treat a headache here is to divert your attention to something else. We're a little more sophisticated than that. Hypnosis is also very helpful in dealing with stress-related disorders. We teach people, as you learn, to imagine they were floating, ask them where they'd rather be, have a sensory alteration that we did together, warmth or coolness. And there are a number of major medical diseases that we can treat using self-hypnosis. Parkinson's, I'll show you an example of how we control stomach acid, and several other examples before we stop for questions. And part of the problem is that because people can modulate their symptoms with their brain, some doctors conclude that there's really nothing wrong physically, and nothing could be farther from the truth. Patients have gone through full childbirth with hypnosis as the only anesthesia. And nobody is going to stand here and tell me that childbirth doesn't hurt, but you can change the way you respond to it. I'll show you an example here of a patient who had Parkinson's disease, a young man with Parkinson's. They sent him to me because you had to do the electrode implantation into the basal ganglia. The patient has to remain awake, so you know you've got the electrode in the right place. But he interrupted surgery twice. So he'd been operated on for an hour and a half twice and couldn't get through the rest of the procedure. So his rather frustrated surgeon, Dr. Height, sent him to me and said, get him ready to get through the procedure. And here he is. And what I noticed, he was rather hypnotizable. And I noticed something when I actually put him into hypnosis.
That's great. Okay, just lie down.
So this is his involuntary tremor.
Okay, how are you feeling now?
Pretty good.
Good.
A little tight in the ankles and his calves.
A little tight in the ankles
So
and
he
calves?
has tightening, you can't see it, but tightening in his legs and his back and his neck as well.
Lower back too. Okay, good. Anywhere else, or is that pretty much it?
And my neck. I'm just up and down my spine.
Mm-hmm.
Real tight.
Up and down your spine. Okay. Okay, good. All right, we're going to get in here. Okay. All right, good. Now what I want you to do is to put yourself into the state of self-hypnosis that we've done together and just take yourself to Hawaii, okay?
Now, do you see what happened? Just stop. And if you told him, stop moving your hand, he said, I can't.
That's good. Deep breath. Breath out, eyes relaxed, let your body float. Just enjoy the floating and picture yourself on the beach in Hawaii planning your activities. And feel the warmth of the sun penetrating into your body. And with each breath out, let a little more of the tension out so your muscles start to feel warm and loose. That's great. Each breath deeper and easier. Now, with your eyes closed and remaining in this state of concentration, please describe how you're feeling right now.
I'm a little wet. My feet are wet because of the sand.
A little wet, huh? The sand is wet. Okay, what else do you notice?
So notice that he's imagining he's on the beach in Hawaii and he's
Oh,
feeling
you're
wet.
nervous about the kids playing near the water, huh? Okay. And how's your body feeling?
Warm.
Warm? Good. So you're feeling comfortable?
Because I'm noon. It's hot.
It's hot, so you feel that hot sun. Good.
Worried about getting sunburn.
Uh-huh. You're worried about getting a sunburn? All right, we better be careful. That's good. Okay. And so you're telling the kids to come closer?
Right.
Good. Are they listening to you?
Yeah.
No? All right. You
Never
bet.
do.
They never do. All right. Good. Keep your body floating. How do your legs feel now?
My back's not sore anymore.
Good. The back's not sore anymore?
My quads are still tight.
Still tight?
And my ankles still tight.
All right. Well, concentrate on the sun and the warmth in the back of your legs. And just let the tension melt away. Each breath deeper and easier, body floating. How are they feeling now?
My back's not sore anymore.
Muscles aren't sore anymore?
My back isn't. My ankles a little tight.
Okay. All right. So
The calves are loosened up.
good. All right. Well, just let the warmth enter and let the tension drain away from your legs. Another deep breath. Each breath deeper and easier, body floating. So this is the exercise that you'll use in preparation for and during your MRI and during your surgery. Just go to Hawaii and enjoy what you can do there as you get your body warm, floating, and comfortable. Right now we'll come out of the state of self-hypnosis together by counting backwards from 3 to 1. On 3, get ready. 2 with your eyelids closed, roll up your eyes, and 1 open. Ready? 3, 2, 1. Good. How are you feeling now, Brian?
Okay.
Okay? Does your body feel different from the way it did before?
My back doesn't hurt anymore.
Your back doesn't hurt anymore. Good.
The neck doesn't hurt.
Your neck doesn't hurt.
No, it's a little salty in my eyes.
Little saltiness in your eyes.
Yeah.
Think it's that salt water?
Yeah.
Okay. Anything else you know?
So, in the space of just a few minutes, you saw that he was able to control an involuntary body movement he couldn't control before. He was able to loosen up most of the muscles in his neck and his back and his legs and change his status. Now, he did still finally eventually have the electrodes implanted, but he got through the procedures. And so this shows you that our brain has an ability to control functions that we ordinarily wouldn't think are within the reach of voluntary control, and techniques like hypnosis can be very helpful to do that. Another example is this experiment we did where we put down a nasogastric tube and measured gastric acid secretion, so secretion of the acid that your stomach makes to digest food. And here you see in the first part of the experiment, we took these people and in the morning they had to not eat anything since the night before. Imagine they were eating a breakfast, an imaginary meal. And they did that, it would go on for an hour. I got very hungry just listening to them describe the meal. And one woman said after half an hour, "Let's stop, I'm full." She had eaten enough of this imaginary meal. We got a significant 89% increase in secretion of gastric acid just eating imaginary food in hypnosis. So in the next condition, we said, we want you to relax and imagine you're somewhere safe and comfortable that involves anything except food or drink. And here we got a significant 39% decrease in gastric acid secretion in patients who did this. And then we injected them with pentagastrin, which is a hormone that the body uses to promote the secretion of gastric acid. And even with that, in the hypnosis condition, we had a significant 19% decrease in gastric acid secretion. So the brain could increase or decrease how much stomach acid you produced. So we have much greater control, and that's that connection to the insula in the brain that helps us regulate how our body is reacting to stress. The third example is teaching people self-hypnosis to stop smoking. This is the smoking gun here. And we teach people not to tell themselves don't smoke. That's like try telling yourself don't think about purple elephants. You know, what do you think about? But instead to focus on 3 concepts. For my body, smoking's a poison. I need my body to live. I owe my body respect and protection in hypnosis. And anytime you have an urge to smoke, don't fight it, admit it, but sit down or lie down, go into the state of self-hypnosis, and reestablish your commitment to respect and protect your body. Think of your body the way you would your favorite pet or your child. You would never think of putting tar and nicotine into a child's lungs if you took out a can of pet food that said, "Warning, the Surgeon General has determined this is dangerous to your dog's health." The only people who tell me they would feed that to their dog are people who hate their dog, but most people don't. So instead, you focus on what you're for, respecting and protecting your body. We find that after a single session of teaching people self-hypnosis, half of them will stop, and half of those people will not touch a cigarette in 2 years. So we get 1 out of 4 long-term abstinence from smoking with a single session of self-hypnosis, which is better outcome than you get from any of the medications or other programs that you use. So teaching people to reprogram their brains and think about the problem of smoking from a different point of view can lead to an important and health-related behavior change. My final example involves this man who was a bricklayer who had a defective ladder fall on his hand. And he had a compound fracture of his index finger. And this is his hand 2.5 years after the injury in full extension. He couldn't open his hand more. And he, it was a real tragedy for him. He'd been making a lot of money, more money than I was making as an assistant professor in those days as a bricklayer. He lost his job. His wife left him. He got depressed. And yet the insurance company said, "We're going to have to amputate your index finger. You'll never have a useful hand." And they were actually secretly filming him. Now, I wouldn't ordinarily believe that, but it was in his medical record. And so they sent him to a wonderful hand surgeon at Stanford, Bob Chase, who said, "I'm not going to amputate this finger. Are you willing to try anything?" He said, well, yeah. Even a psychiatrist? Well, maybe. Even one who uses hypnosis? He said, I'll try anything, doc. So he came to see me, and I said, you know, I don't know why your hand is like this, and I don't care. Do you want to get better? And he said, yes. And I said, well, you have horrible circulation in your hand, as you and I would if we held our hand like this for 2.5 years. You have 4 centimeters less muscle mass in your left hand than you do in your right. So you need to develop tremors in your hand to build up the strength and circulation. So he sat in my office for half an hour in hypnosis with his hand shaking, sweat pouring off his forehead, and I thought, this is not a man who's not motivated to get better. So he did this twice a day for half an hour, and by the end of 2 months, he had full extension of all the fingers except the originally fractured one. And Dr. Chase put a dynamic splint on the original finger to gradually stretch it. We also gave him an old tennis ball to exercise with, and he actually ruptured some ligaments in his hand. He was trying too hard, and we had to tell him to slow down, take it easy. By the end of a year, he had full extension of the hand, and now he could make a real fist. He came to my clinic carrying a 35-pound brick, and the secretary was afraid he was going to throw it through the window. He just wanted to prove to me that he could, again, hold a brick and use the mortar and go back to bricklaying. And the insurance company didn't believe that he could actually use his hand. And he had to take them to court to get himself off disability so that he could go back to work. And once again, he is back at work. He's now a contractor and making, again, more money than I am. And you know, the funny thing is that he would sit there. You know, one of the major misconceptions people have about hypnosis is that it's taking control over somebody. And all I was doing was teaching him how to enhance his control of his own body. And so when I would be explaining this to the medical students, he'd be sitting there and saying, Doc, when do I get to show them what I did? And he was right about that. It wasn't what I did to him. It was what I showed him how to do for himself. So hypnosis can be a powerful way of controlling the way our brain functions, the way we process signals like pain, the way we control motor movement in problems like Parkinson's and in this kind of physical rehabilitation. So it's an opportunity that is based on good brain science and clear studies of outcome for us to take much better charge of how we run our bodies. Anyone interested? My late father and I wrote a textbook about this called Trance and Treatment, Clinical Uses of Hypnosis. I want to acknowledge our sources of support, the National Center of what is now called Complementary and Integrative Health, the National Institute on Aging, the National Cancer Institute, National Institute of Mental Health, the California Breast Cancer Research Program, the Dana and MacArthur Foundations as well. And I am very relieved to have heard while I was in Washington the other day that while President Trump had been threatening to cut the NIH budget by 18%, it looks like there's a bipartisan agreement that there will be a 6% increase in the NIH budget, which is a wonderful thing. So they have enabled me to do this kind of work and thousands of other scientists to help make everybody's health and life better. He says, stress is killing you. You need an easier job, a smaller house, and a different family. This is our Center for Integrative Medicine at Stanford. We've been in business for 19 years using techniques like hypnosis, mindfulness, acupuncture, meditation to help patients cope better with a variety of serious medical and psychological problems. We treat pain, headache, cancer, fibromyalgia, chronic fatigue, a number of problems in which we try to help people learn to better manage their own bodies. But the mind-body relationship is nothing to fool around with. He's saying, what happened here, Sergeant? And he says, a placebo overdose. We're pretty sure he only thinks he's dead. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Dr. Spiegel. This was wonderful. We do have a few minutes for some questions.
There's a gentleman right there.
And we will take this one first.
What are the similarities and dissimilarities between hypnosis and meditation?
Well, thank you for that question. You know, I'm very happy that one of the oldest Eastern traditions in what we might consider psychotherapy is now becoming widely available and popular here. Part of the difference is what they're used for. So in the West, we're very problem-focused, and we want to accomplish things. So hypnosis tends to be used to solve a problem, smoking, pain, stress, things like that. The idea of mindfulness is it's just a way of being, and if it happens to help you with some medically related problem, that's a good thing. In hypnosis, we focus attention a lot. You do that sometimes in meditation, too, and what's called the body scan, where you move around your body and feel different things. But the idea also is not to control what you feel, as we do with hypnosis, but actually to just let feelings wash through you. That's called open presence in mindfulness, where if you're angry or fearful or sad or in pain, you just kind of sit with the feeling and don't fight it and let it flow by the way a storm would go by. So it's a different approach in which you're not trying to regulate and control, but simply be open to the experience. And the third part in a lot of meditation is focusing on compassion, being compassionate with people, both people known to you and people not known to you, which is somewhat related perhaps to suggestibility in hypnosis, but different. There are also different things happening in the brain. Mindfulness tends to be more something that you learn to do and you do better. So there's actually been studies, Richard Davidson at the University of Wisconsin has shown increase in activity and sometimes growth of the left prefrontal cortex, which tends to elevate mood. And there's a group at the University of Massachusetts now that has shown reduction in activity in part of the default mode network that I mentioned earlier, the posterior cingulate cortex. So there are related but different changes in the brain when people go into these states as well. We have more to learn about it. We're doing some active research on that now. So they're similar, but they're not the same thing. Yeah.
You've shown how the essential tremors, like Parkinson's and I suppose essential tremors, can be controlled, at least temporarily. I'm wondering if those tremors, if there's a way hypnosis can help someone control those tremors like all day long or on a more permanent basis.
One of the things, there are two issues that you raise in this question, and one of them is, well, so you can do this acutely, but what effect does it have in the long term? Well, as you saw, some of our chronic cancer patients got long-term pain control. The nice thing about hypnosis is you don't have to be in a trance all the time, but when the problem gets bad, you can hypnotize yourself again. So you've got the treatment with you all the time, and you can just sit down or lie down and go into the state. So some people with chronic tremors can get some benefit. I have helped some people like that. Usually it's not the whole story, and sometimes some medications that help in combination can be very good. One of the interesting things about these tremors is that they are very much stress and anxiety related. So the person will have the basic tremor, but if they're in a social situation like this, I mean, I've seen people giving lectures holding their hands to not magnify the tremor by magnifying the shaking of the... So stress will make it worse, and sometimes you can help people better manage the stress, not be so anxious about the fact that people might notice that they have this tremor, or make a joke about it. I know patients who will do that. He'll say, you guys really make me nervous, so you're going to see how I shake, you know, something like that. So you can teach people to deal with the secondary amplification of a symptom that comes with stress. People with MS, for example, can often get around very well, but when they have to get on a bus, the symptoms get worse because there's so much social pressure to function physically and get on the bus and not slow it down. So there clearly, with a lot of neurologic diseases, there is a stress and anxiety related component, and that's the part where hypnosis can be very helpful.
Could you expand on acupuncture?
So acupuncture is an ancient Eastern technique in which needles are usually put under the skin at certain nodes. There are 365 points that are meant to represent sort of what are called chakras or lines of energy within the body, developed in Japan and in China. And there is pretty clear evidence that acupuncture is very helpful, particularly for pain. Some people find it relaxing too. It's different from hypnosis in that you're not formally supposed to go into some altered mental state. It's mostly a physical manipulation. There are some studies that show that more hypnotizable people actually get better results from acupuncture. So it may function as a kind of hypnotic induction ceremony. But a big difference is, I mentioned earlier the endogenous opiate system. If you block the endogenous opiate system with naloxone, a commonly used anti-opiate drug, you block the effect of acupuncture. So it seems to stimulate the body's secretion of its own endogenous opiates. Hypnosis is not blocked by naloxone. So it seems to work by a different pathway. A lot of the endogenous opiates are in the spinal cord and lower parts of the brain. So it's a different part of the central nervous system that's involved in acupuncture analgesia, but there is some overlap.
My name is Barbara Tippin-Sprigg, and I'm a retired physician.
Yes.
I learned self-hypnosis 30 years ago at the Gestalt Institute in Cleveland. It's been invaluable ever since.
Great.
But we're now in north central Florida in a small city. Do you have any recommendations here? Because it really does help to have people have another person help them learn this technique. Who can we go to here rather than traveling to Stanford?
I think you should come to Stanford. No, there are a couple of key issues about finding a good practitioner to help you with hypnosis, and I'm very glad to hear that it's been helpful to you in the past. And it does help to get that kind of reinforcement, and also to think about different ways of using the technique. There are two professional hypnosis societies, one the Society for Clinical and Experimental Hypnosis, and the website is sceh.us, and the other is the American Society for Clinical Hypnosis, asch.net. And both of them have referral services, can help you get in touch with a professional in this area. The other is that sometimes primary care docs know of professionals who practice hypnosis. The key thing is you don't want a hypnotist. You don't want somebody in what we used to call the yellow pages who took a weekend course and is doing hypnosis. You want a licensed and trained professional in medicine, dentistry, psychology, or other clinical disciplines who also knows about hypnosis. But searching those two professional societies can be a path to getting a good referral.
We have time for one more question here up front. Okay, ma'am.
You talked about many things here, and they were very interesting, but one in particular is the area of hypnosis and early onset dementia. You're talking about the same areas of the brain that are affected. Could you expand on that?
Well, one of the sad things about dementia, early onset of any kind, is that it tends to impair the ability to concentrate. So it makes sense that some of those similar regions would be involved, but unfortunately, from the point of view of hypnosis as a treatment, it means that as dementia starts, it's much less likely that the person would be able to use it to help with any symptoms that come up. So you're right, there's similar brain regions, but if those regions are damaged, when you turn down the anterior cingulate, you still have exquisite control of how active it is. But if you start to develop dementia, now it's other brain regions as well, the hippocampus and other regions that store and retrieve memories, which are not directly involved in hypnosis. But if people just can't stay with you and remember the instructions, unfortunately, they're less likely to be able to respond.
I'd like for us to take this opportunity to thank our speaker one last time, Dr. Spiegel.